Welcome back to Woman Circus. My name is Christina, and today I am going to be doing a segment called Mystery, Crime, and Crochet. And I am going to be doing a project on a pickle, and it is a free pattern that I found, and I'm just going to go ahead and crochet while I go ahead and tell you a story. If you'd like to see the pattern, where it came from, or that way you can make your own, the description will be down below, so you can go ahead and do that. So today we are going to talk about Robert Lee Yates, otherwise known as the grocery bag killer. His killing spree started in the Spokane, Washington area in February of 1990. That's when the first body was found, and it was of a woman named Yolanda. She was a known sex worker in the area, and she was found on the bank of the Spokane River. She was almost naked, and but she was also wrapped in a green blanket, and she had multiple gunshot wounds. Something they noted, though, was that when looking around the area that they found her, they didn't see any signs of the weapon that was used. And when they did see that she had the gunshot wounds, they did not find any spent bullet casings or anything like that. That led them to obviously believe that the killer either killed her there and cleaned up the scene, or that they had killed her in another area and then just dumped her body there. The next killing ended up happening about a month later in March, and that was a 30-year-old woman named Nikki Lowe, and she was actually found in the middle of a street in Spokane in the early morning, and she also had gunshot wounds and was known to be a sex worker as well, and she had a drug problem, or was known to have a drug problem. And when they did the autopsy on her, they did detect cocaine in her system, and the person that did the autopsy also noted that she had a strong smell permeating from her body of motor oil. 7 weeks would go by until the next murder happened, and in that time they had no leads or anything like that, but in May of that year, so May of 1990, the third body was found, and this was found at the Spokane River also. Another female, and she was basically naked again except for some rings on her fingers, and she had a gunshot wound, just like the first two victims did, and she had signs on her, mostly her face and her head, that she had been beaten or possibly bludgeoned also with an object. And this victim's name was Kathleen, and toxicology reports detected drugs in her system, and she also had been a sex worker in the area and known for that. And at the scene, the detectives were able to find items like a cigarette butt, and fibers were also pulled from her body. And they also found tire tracks close to her body, or in the area that they had found it. After this, Robert would not kill for another 4 years. So in that time, they had nothing on him or anything like that. But after 4 years, the fourth victim would be killed, and this time detectives didn't know if the killer had moved on or stopped killing altogether, or had just kept killing but was keeping it under wraps and better at hiding it. And one thing to note too is at this time in Washington State, so Spokane is on the eastern side of Washington State, and then on the western side was where serial killer the Green River Killer, who is Gary Ridgway, was also killing at this time. So there were times when they thought possibly these could be connected, but then they started noticing a few differences between Gary's killings and then Robert's killings, which obviously they didn't know it was Robert at the time. And so it was just something that they, had to look at pretty closely. But this fourth victim was also had gunshot wounds and fibers that were collected at the scene. And then in 1995, a fifth victim was killed, and this time it was in Kitsap County, which is on the western side of Washington. So instead of being in Spokane, it was in Kitsap County, and it was of a 64-year-old woman, and she was a little bit different from the previous 4 killings because she was found, like I said, on the western side of the state. And it was also different because she had no links to prostitution or drugs. She was only known to drink alcohol, and that was pretty much the only thing that had come up on her toxicology reports. After that, the next killing wasn't until about 10 months later in 1996 when the body of 39-year-old woman was found on Mount Spokane. Instead of being almost nude like the other victims, she was actually wearing a dress when she was found, and she also had a towel draped over her torso area. Unfortunately, they didn't find any identification on or near her body, so they had to do fingerprinting instead to kind of figure out who she was, and it came up as a woman named Shannon Zielinski. And she too had been shot to death, but there was no links. She had no links herself to prostitution or drugs, so that was a little bit more different than the other ones. And then he didn't kill again, until the next year in 1997 in August, when they actually found 2 bodies. So they found the body of Heather Hernandez, and she was found in a field in Spokane wearing just a shirt and a bra, and nothing else was found on her body except for that, and there were no items or anything found near her body. What they did find, though, is that there was a parking lot that was nearby, and they could see from the parking lot to where she was found in the field, there had been a blood trail, and she was shot, which is obviously where the blood had come from. And so that meant that she was either shot in the parking lot and then dragged to the field, or she had been shot at a separate location and then brought to the parking lot and then dragged into the field. They questioned at this time, the second body was found after this, and it was as a 16-year-old female, and her name was Jennifer Joseph, and she too had multiple gunshot wounds, and she had been killed in a different spot and dumped where they had found her, just like the previous one. And when Jennifer even though she was 16, she was unfortunately known to be a sex worker. And so they started questioning sex workers in the area that Jennifer was said to have been before her murder. And people had said that they had last seen her with a white male who was possibly driving a white Corvette, which was the first lead that the detectives had even got of any of these killings, and locating a possible suspect. With the pattern of the killings being mostly sex workers in the Spokane area, the Spokane police, as well as detectives, would patrol the areas known for having sex workers, and they would patrol the areas, and they would do it more frequently than they normally would. And during these patrols, without even knowing it, the area, they had actually seen and pulled over a man named Robert L. Yates Jr. And this was their first interaction with him. They didn't know at the time that it was, but he was driving a white Corvette, and he was pulled over for a minor traffic infraction. And the connection to all this was the white Corvette, just like the previous person had mentioned in Jennifer's case. But it wasn't even a consideration at the time, because unfortunately the cop who had stopped him and wrote him a ticket for the infraction actually wrote down that he had that the vehicle that he was driving was a Camaro, not a Corvette. So later on, when they had actually, run the registration and things like that and checked on it, it turned out to be the Corvette and not the Camaro. So they did figure that out later. In 1997, which these killings happened in August, so this is in November now, a body was found in a shallow grave, and that was of a woman named Darla Scott. She was a known sex worker in the area, and she too had died of gunshot wounds. And then about a month later, another victim was found, but this time, again, like the previous one that was in Western Washington in Kitsap County, this one was found in Tacoma, and it was a nude female body that was found, and she was just on the road and, by a bush. She wasn't well concealed or anything. They did notice that this time this victim had a plastic bag that was covering her head, and they found spent shell casings near her body. And this woman's name was Linda Mercer, and she was 34 years old. They did notice her handbag was missing as well, and some of the jewelry that she normally wore or was known to wear had also been missing when they found her. And she also was a known sex worker and drug user. And the toxicology report during her autopsy did show that she did have drugs in her system. Since they started noticing so many of the victims had items, even just smaller items missing from them when their murder would happen, they were thinking, once it got to Linda, since her whole handbag the jewelry was missing, that, they were thinking that their killer was taking these items from the victims to keep as sort of a trophy. So if you're not familiar, some serial killers will take items from their victims as what they call trophy killings. So it's something that they do. Sometimes it can be jewelry, sometimes it's clothing, sometimes it's hair, and then there's sometimes also that it's body parts. So it just depends on the person and what they're taking, and I guess kind of what they're into. But yeah, they were starting to notice that as a pattern. Just a few days after Linda was found in Tacoma, another body was found back in Spokane about a week before Christmas in the same area that Darla had been found back in November. And just like Linda, her head was covered with plastic bags, and she had a gunshot wound, multiple gunshot wounds, and her body had been rolled into an embankment about 25 feet from the road. Investigators were able to collect hairs and fiber from her body, which the crime scene labs were able to have tested. This body was of a 36-year-old woman, and her name was Chanel Johnson. She too was a known prostitute in the area, and she had actually gone missing back in October. Nobody had heard really from her since, and October was the last time that they had heard from her, but they didn't actually find her body until, like we said, in the day after Christmas, a week before Christmas. After Chanel was found, and then just to note, since these victims were turning up with the bags wrapped around their head, that is actually how Robert got the name or the nickname of the grocery bag killer. And after Chanel was found, 2 more bodies were found the day after Christmas in Spokane again. But unlike the other victims, these 2 bodies were fully clothed except for their shoes were missing. And then after that, he had quite a few on his list here, but after that, he didn't strike again until about February of 1998. And this woman's name was Sunny Oster, who was also a known sex worker in the area. She had the same thing as the other ones, the plastic bag covering her head, the gunshot wounds, and her handbag was also missing, which she was known to carry. The next killing was in April of 98, and that was a body that was found of a woman named Linda Mabin. Her body, as well as the two bodies found the day after Christmas, were covered surprisingly in vegetation. And for where their bodies were dropped, it was not vegetation known to that area. So that right there was a big clue for detectives to know that, you know, they had this vegetation found on their bodies, which is like the soil and things like that. And I believe it was seeds and I want to say like yard debris that was found with them. And it let detectives know that they were killed in another area and that their bodies were just dumped in the area that they had found them, because these were more rural areas, and, or excuse me, not rural, urban areas. And so obviously they didn't have that stuff around there, and that's what let them know that they were dumped there, and that this piece came, or these items, or the vegetation, I guess that's the word I used, is what came from the other area that they had actually been killed in. So they thought maybe the person that had killed them, this vegetation came from that killer's home. The next killing was in July of 98, and this was a woman named Michelin Durnings, and her body was found in a vacant lot. She too had gunshot wounds, and something that was missing from her was she actually had lower dentures that her name was engraved in, and they were never able to find those. So they think that that was something that he had possibly taken. And they had found her body, and it was covered with items like styrofoam, and it actually had 2 hot tub covers over it when they found it. And yeah, it was just really odd with that one that had all that stuff on top of her. And then after that, there was another body that was found in Tacoma. Not a ton of details on that one, but at this time the death toll had grown to 17 murders, and as police were gathering evidence through these years, they were finally starting to see connections. They were noticing, since all of them had the gunshot wounds, that, you know, the bullets that they were able to find, or pieces that they were able to find of the bullets themselves, or the casings, they were all a certain brand that was actually sold in the Spokane area only. I think it was called Magnet, or Magtech was the name of the bullet. And then they were also able to figure out that with the bullets and the casings they found, that some of the bodies had actually been shot from the same exact gun. So the ones that they weren't able to come to this conclusion was only just because the bullets or casings that were found by them or in them were too badly damaged to make that determination. But I mean, obviously you can, you know, put it together, but as a whole, they couldn't determine that just because of those inconsistencies with the bullets not being able to be determined that way. A solid piece of evidence they were able to find with the victims was all of them were swabbed for DNA. They wanted to make sure that they weren't essayed, and they weren't completely sure if they were or not. So they did swab them, and every victim that was swabbed, they were able to find had a trace of sperm in them. And when they tested the sperm, they did note that the DNA typing that they were able to see belonged to the same exact suspect. So that right there was a solid connection for sure. And so, you know, they're still patrolling the areas of the sex workers and things like that, just because it's still going on. They don't have a solid suspect yet. And while on patrol, a detective noticed that a white male had picked up a woman in the area, and she was known for prostitution. They ended up pulling over the vehicle, and it was Robert L. Yates. He gave a story that the girl he had picked up, that her father had asked, that it was his friend, that her father was his friend, and that he had asked him to come pick her up and take her home. And so the one that pulled him over, he took the girl and, he asked her questions and asked her the same thing, and she corroborated with the same story, saying the same thing as Robert. And so at that point they couldn't do anything further because, she wasn't saying she was in trouble or anything like that. So once that happened, word started to get around in the police office that there was a report of an attack on a woman named Christine back in November. The report, Christine stated, in the report, Christine had stated that she was picked up by a tall white male who seemed to be about 50 years of age, with sandy blonde hair and slight pockmarks on his face. She said they went to a location where she would service him in the back of the van he was driving, because she was a sex worker. And while trying to service him orally, he was not able to get an erection, and he then struck Christine on the side of the head with an object that she couldn't see when that happened. He started yelling at her and demanded his money back. And while Christine was scrambling and trying to get out of the van, she went to the back and the side to where the door normally would be on the van, and she, for some reason, could not find the door handle. So she had to crawl her way up through the front of the van in order to even get out. After that happened, she ran to a nearby hospital where the security guard would help her, and she had to get stitches for the gash that was bleeding from the gash that was bleeding on her head and from where she was hit. And the description she gave this night, of the night and the man she was with, immediately had them thinking of Robert Yates. And so since they had figured this out, they went to visit him at his house, and they had got there and he wasn't home. So they ended up leaving a message for him to contact them. Surprisingly, that same day, Yates had actually contacted them back, and they set up a time to meet the next day. When he came in the next day, it was noted that he was sweating profusely and looked really nervous before they had even gotten into the room for questioning. While in questioning, they asked about the incident that occurred when he had been pulled over previously with the girl that he said he had taken home. And he had stated the same story, that, the girl's father asked him to take her home and that it was a friend of his. But then they also asked him, what was the dad or the father of the girl's name. And at the time he said he couldn't remember. So they asked if he had any interactions with prostitutes, which he denied, except for saying he had a few years back when he was in Germany while serving in the military. And then he was asked by the police officers if he could provide a DNA sample. And he told them that he wanted to discuss the matter with his wife. And then once he did that, he would make a decision after speaking with her and get back to them with what he decided. And he did call them back, and he said he would not be providing a sample. So who is Robert L. Yates? So he was a family man with a wife and 5 kids. He had grown up in Washington State on Whidbey Island, and as a child, his mother had passed away. And it was also mentioned that he was essayed as a 6-year-old by an older neighbor boy. It was never confirmed, but this is just what was said. After graduation, he attended Walla Walla Community College, but ended up dropping out after 2 years, and then he had found a job at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. The next year, he got married and enlisted in the military, where he would become a helicopter pilot and would serve in Desert Storm. He also helped in rescues during Hurricane Andrew, and he also did some rescue missions in Somalia. He had earned a lot of awards and medals and was honorably discharged, and after that he had joined the Army National Guard, and he was actually highly respected due to his military history, as well as being one of the only people in the state that could fly a certain kind of helicopter, which is pretty surprising. Yates's wife was soon brought in for questioning, and she had admitted that she had seen at one point a lot of blood in the back of a van that he used to own, and apparently he had left the previous evening to take his daughter to a friend's house, and he didn't come back until the next morning. And when she looked in the back of the van when he had gotten home, she had noticed there was blood all over the back, and he told her that he had hit a dog and put it in the back of the van in order to take it to the vet for help. After explaining all this, he went inside, got cleaning supplies, came back to the van and started cleaning up. And then after cleaning, he took the cushion from the van that was in the back that had all the blood that had seeped into it, gotten rid of it, and replaced it with a new one. After this, detectives were able to get a hold of and speak to the girl that they had pulled him over with previously, that had said that, you know, that he was taking her home to her father. And she finally, you know, stated and admitted that she was a sex worker, and when they pulled him over, she had told Yates to tell that story, and she had basically said that she had lied to them. So when speaking with Robert, it came out about when asking about his vehicle that he drove, they had sold the white Corvette that he had and been pulled over with. He had sold that Corvette to a friend. The police were able to track down the friend and question her, and they had found out that he had owned the car from 1994 to 1998, and that at one point had gotten the carpeting replaced, actually not once but twice in the vehicle. Samples were taken from the fibers of the car, and when looking more into the car, they were able to see that the fibers collected matched fibers found on Jennifer Joseph and Heather Hernandez. So they also found what appeared to be blood stains on the passenger seat, the passenger seat belt, the passenger seat, and then as well as the passenger floorboard. Chemical testing was done to determine that blood was also found on the driver's seat, the passenger seat, and then also dried blood was found under the passenger seat, which was taken in for DNA testing, and it actually ended up matching with Jennifer Joseph, who they actually got DNA swabs from her parents, and in matching those DNA, it would match up to Jennifer's DNA. On Tuesday, April 18th, 2000, Robert L. Yates Jr. was arrested for the murder of Jennifer Joseph, and at this time, they were finally able to get a DNA swab test done on Yates, which matched the DNA samples found on all of the bodies of the multiple victims. When going and searching his home, detectives were able to identify vegetation that was also a match to the vegetation that had been found on a couple of the victims. And then they ended up finding the van that he had previously used, and were able to find blood matter in the van, and it was tested. And they were also able to find some bullets, spent bullets in the van as well. And so, you know, this just sealed the deal. So at the age of 48, Yates was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder and suspected in the death of 18 women. He was charged with first-degree attempted murder and first-degree burglary for Christine Smith, who was the one that got hit in the head. He, of course, pled not guilty to all charges, but was charged with 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, 13 counts of first-degree murder, and attempted first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, but was later turned over to life in prison without parole due to Washington State ruling capital punishment as unconstitutional in 2018. Robert L. Yates is currently serving life in prison at the Washington State Penitentiary. All right, well, that concludes our case for the day. Let me know what you think, if you liked this, and remember, this is my first one, so it's only going to get better from here. I know it's a little rough today being my first one, but I promise it'll get better. I hope you guys like the pickle and how it turned out, and you can always add eyes and a mouth to make it look super cute and like a character. And yeah, if you like this video, like, comment, or subscribe, and let me know what you think. Have a great day. Bye.